Vladimir Putin, a childhood forged in shadows. October 7, 1952. In a city still haunted by the ghosts of war, in a communal apartment where 3 families shared one bathroom, a child was born who would one day control the largest nation on earth. His name was Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. But to understand this child, we must first understand the world into which he was born. A world of rubble and rats. A world of trauma and survival. A world shaped by one of the most horrific sieges in human history. This is the story of Vladimir Putin's childhood. Not the sanitized version told in official biographies, but the raw, brutal reality of a boy who grew up in the shadows of war, in the streets of a broken city, in a family haunted by unimaginable loss. Part 1: The Shadow of the Siege. To understand Vladimir Putin's childhood, we must go back 7 years before his birth, to September 8, 1941. On that date, Nazi forces completed their encirclement of Leningrad, beginning what would become one of the most devastating sieges in human history. The siege of Leningrad would last 872 days. Nearly 2.5 years of systematic starvation, bombardment, and death. Hitler's strategy was simple and brutal. Rather than assault the city directly and risk heavy German casualties, he would starve it into submission. The order was clear: no surrender would be accepted. The population was to be annihilated. When the siege began, Leningrad had a population of approximately 3.5 million people. The city had been Russia's imperial capital, a jewel of culture and architecture. It was home to the Hermitage Museum, to grand palaces, to universities and theaters. Within months, it became hell on earth. The first winter of the siege, 1941 to 1942, was the worst. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. There was no heat in the apartments, no electricity, no running water, and most crucially, almost no food. Daily rations were reduced to 125 grams of bread per person. That is less than 3 thin slices. And this bread was not real bread. It was mixed with sawdust, cellulose, and whatever else could be ground into flour. People ate wallpaper paste, believing it was made from potatoes. They boiled leather belts and shoes to make a thin protein jelly. They ate cats and dogs. They ate rats. And when there was nothing else, some turned to the unthinkable. More than 260 people were arrested for cannibalism during the siege. Every day, people collapsed in the streets from starvation and cold. Their bodies froze where they fell. The ground was too hard to dig graves, and there were too many dead to bury. Bodies piled up in the streets, on staircases, in courtyards. Trucks came through periodically to collect the corpses and take them to mass graves. By the time the siege was finally broken on January 27, 1944, more than 1 million people had died. Some estimates put the number even higher. The city's population had been reduced from 3.5 million to just 700,000 survivors. Among those survivors were a man and a woman who would become Vladimir Putin's parents. Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, Putin's father, was born in 1911. He had served in the Soviet Navy's submarine fleet in the early 1930s. When war broke out, he was working in a factory in Leningrad. Although he had an exemption from military service because he worked in defense production, he volunteered anyway. He served in an NKVD destruction battalion, special units tasked with sabotage operations behind enemy lines. These were dangerous, often suicidal missions. The NKVD battalions operated in occupied territories, blowing up bridges, disrupting supply lines, and gathering intelligence. On one such mission, Vladimir Spiridanovich's unit was trapped by German forces on the banks of the Neva River. They had almost no chance of surviving. The Germans surrounded them on all sides. Bullets and shells rained down on the frozen river. Vladimir Spiridonovich was hit by grenade shrapnel. The wounds to his legs were severe. He couldn't walk. He should have died there, on that frozen river. But a fellow soldier, whose name is lost to history, dragged him across the ice under heavy fire. Then, when they reached safety, this soldier carried Vladimir Spiridonovich on his back all the way to a field hospital. He made sure Putin's father received medical attention, and then he said, "Well, that's it. You're going to live, and I'm going forth to die." Miraculously, both men survived the war. Years later, Vladimir Spiridonovich encountered his savior in Leningrad and was able to thank him. But Vladimir Spiridanovich's ordeal was far from over. He spent months in the hospital, slowly recovering from his wounds. His legs were permanently damaged. He would walk with difficulty for the rest of his life. While he lay in that hospital bed, his wife was fighting her own battle for survival in the besieged city. Maria Ivanovna Shelemova, Putin's mother, was born in 1911, the same year as her husband. She came from a family of peasants and workers. When the siege began, she was 30 years old and had 2 young sons. The first son, whose name was also Vladimir, had died in infancy in the 1930s, before the war. The second son, Victor, was born in 1940. He was just a year old when the siege began. As the situation in Leningrad became increasingly desperate, Maria Ivanovna made a terrible choice that thousands of other mothers had to make. She sent Victor to a children's shelter, hoping he would have a better chance of survival there, while she stayed in the city to search for food. It was a gamble, a desperate hope that the authorities could provide better care for children than starving parents could. But the shelters were overwhelmed. There was not enough food, not enough medicine. Disease spread rapidly through the crowded dormitories. Victor contracted diphtheria. He was 2 years old. In a city with adequate medical care and nutrition, diphtheria was survivable. But in besieged Leningrad, with no antibiotics, no heat, and starving children whose immune systems had collapsed, it was a death sentence. Victor died in that shelter. His mother never knew exactly when or where he was buried. He was likely placed in one of the mass graves, mixed with thousands of other victims whose names were never recorded. Meanwhile, Maria Ivanovna herself was slowly starving to death. She weighed perhaps 80 pounds. Her body was consuming itself. She moved slowly, every action requiring enormous effort. She scavenged for anything edible. She stood in lines for hours in the freezing cold, hoping for a tiny ration of bread. When she learned that her husband was in a hospital, she walked there every day to see him. It was a long journey, and she was half dead herself. But she went. Vladimir Spiridonovich, seeing the condition she was in, began secretly giving her his own food rations. He hid the food from the nurses, slipping it to Maria when no one was looking. But the doctors noticed. They saw that he was fainting from hunger. When they figured out what he was doing, they gave him a stern lecture and banned Maria from visiting for a while. They had to keep him alive. Maria's own survival came down to moments of pure chance. One day, weakened by starvation, she collapsed in the street. People passing by assumed she was dead. They laid her body near a pile of corpses, waiting for the truck that would come to collect the dead and take them to the mass graves. She lay there, perhaps for hours, motionless, barely breathing. Then she woke up. She began to moan weakly. Someone heard her and realized she was still alive. They pulled her away from the corpses. It was the narrowest of escapes. Had she woken up just a little later, after the truck had come, she would have been buried alive or burned with the other bodies. Maria Ivanovna survived. Her husband survived. But they had lost a son. They had lost friends, neighbors, relatives. They had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. When the siege was finally lifted in January 1944, Leningrad was a city of ghosts. The buildings were pockmarked with shrapnel. The streets were empty. The survivors were skeletal, traumatized, forever changed. Vladimir Spiridonovich and Maria Ivanovna remained in Leningrad after the war. They moved into a communal apartment at 15 Barskov Lane. They tried to rebuild their lives. But how do you recover from such trauma? How do you move forward after losing a child, after nearly dying yourself, after witnessing the death of a city? For 7 years, they remained childless. Perhaps they were afraid to bring another child into a world that had proven so cruel. Perhaps Maria's health, ruined by starvation, made pregnancy difficult. But in 1952, Maria became pregnant again. She was 41 years old, an extremely late age for childbirth by Soviet standards, especially for a working-class woman whose body had been devastated by malnutrition. On October 7, 1952, she gave birth to a son. They named him Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He was not just a new child. He was a replacement child, a living memorial to the brothers who had died before him, the repository of his mother's grief and trauma, her hopes and fears. Vladimir would never meet his brothers, but their ghosts would hover over his childhood, invisible but always present. Part 2. Life in the communal apartment. The apartment at 15 Barskov Lane, where Vladimir Putin spent his childhood, was typical of Soviet communal living arrangements, but that doesn't make it any less shocking by Western standards. 3 families, totaling perhaps 15 to 20 people, shared a single apartment. There was one kitchen, one bathroom, no privacy, no personal space, constant tension. The Putin family occupied a single room, one room for 3 people, a mother, a father, and a son. They cooked in the shared kitchen, where other families were also trying to prepare meals. They waited in line to use the single bathroom. The building itself was in terrible condition. It had been damaged during the war and never properly repaired. The stairwells were dark and dirty. There was no hot water. In winter, the heating was inadequate. The cold seeped through the walls. And there were rats. Not just a few rats, but an infestation. They lived in the walls, in the basement, in the spaces between floors. You could hear them at night, scratching and squeaking. They were bold, unafraid. They would venture into the apartments looking for food. Young Vladimir would later recall that he and other boys would hunt these rats in the stairwells with sticks. It was a game, but also a necessity. The rats were everywhere. One day, when Vladimir was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, he cornered a large rat in the stairwell. He had a stick and was hitting at it, trying to kill it or drive it away. The rat, trapped and desperate, did something unexpected. Instead of running, it turned and lunged directly at Vladimir. It leaped at him with its teeth bared, attacking its attacker. Vladimir was shocked. He jumped back, barely avoiding the rat, and ran away. He would later say that this moment taught him an important lesson: never back an opponent into a corner with no way out, because a cornered enemy becomes the most dangerous enemy of all. Whether this lesson from a rat truly shaped his political philosophy, or whether it's a story crafted to fit a narrative, is impossible to know. But Vladimir Putin has told this story many times. It clearly meant something to him. Life in that communal apartment was hard in other ways too. Vladimir's father worked at the Yegorov railway car factory. It was manual labor, physically demanding, and it paid very little. His legs, damaged during the war, gave him constant pain. He limped. But he worked, because that's what you did. You survived. Maria Ivanovna worked a series of jobs. She was a factory worker. She worked as a janitor. She did whatever work she could find to bring in a little extra money. Like her husband, she bore the scars of the siege. She was thin, worn down, chronically unwell. Both of Vladimir's parents suffered from what we would now recognize as severe trauma and depression. They had survived the unsurvivable, but at a cost. They were emotionally distant, absorbed in their own pain. They worked long hours and came home exhausted. Young Vladimir was often left to fend for himself. There's evidence that, at least for part of his early childhood, he was sent to live with another family while his parents worked. This was not uncommon in the Soviet Union, where childcare was scarce and parents had to work to survive. But for a child, being sent away from your parents is an experience of abandonment, even if it's done out of necessity. It creates feelings of insecurity, of not being wanted, of having to fight for your place in the world. When Vladimir was home, the apartment was crowded and chaotic. There were arguments between the families. Tension over whose turn it was to use the kitchen. Complaints about noise, about smells, about children. Vladimir was a small, slight boy. He was not physically imposing. And in the rough working-class environment of post-war Leningrad, being small made you a target. The courtyard of the apartment building was where the children played. It was called the Dvor, a communal outdoor space surrounded by the apartment buildings. This was where you learned the rules of survival. The Dvor was not a friendly place. It was hierarchical, brutal. Older boys dominated younger ones. Strength mattered. Toughness mattered. If you showed weakness, you were bullied mercilessly. Vladimir was bullied. He was often beaten up by older, bigger boys. He would come home with bruises, with a bloody nose. And his parents, themselves traumatized and struggling, had little emotional capacity to comfort him. This was just how life was. You fought. You survived. Or you didn't. Vladimir spent much of his time in the streets and courtyards of his neighborhood. He ran with a group of other boys, a street gang of sorts. They weren't organized criminals, but they weren't angels either. They fought with boys from other neighborhoods. They got into trouble. They stole small things. They lived by the law of the street. In his own words, Vladimir was a hooligan. He was not a good student. He was easily distracted in class. He talked back to teachers. He threw erasers at other students. He got into fights. His grade book from primary school, later found and published by a Russian newspaper, shows a litany of complaints. Behaved badly during singing class. Talks in class. Didn't do his math homework. Threw chalkboard erasers at the children. He was caught passing notes to a boy named Bagandov when he should have been paying attention to the teacher. He skipped homework assignments. He was, by all accounts, a difficult, disruptive student. But beneath the troublemaking exterior, there was something else. A fierce intelligence, a cunning, an ability to read people and situations, and a burning need to prove himself, to overcome the weakness of being small and bullied. Vladimir was drawn to stories of heroes. Soviet spy films were popular in the 1960s, especially a television series called The Shield and the Sword, which aired in 1968 when Vladimir was 16. The series told the story of a Soviet intelligence officer who infiltrates Nazi Germany, living under deep cover, risking his life to serve the motherland. It was propaganda, of course, but it was also thrilling. The hero was smart, not necessarily physically strong. He used his wits. He was patient. He was loyal to a cause larger than himself. Vladimir watched that series and was captivated. This, he decided, was what he wanted to be. Not a factory worker like his father. Not a janitor like his mother. He wanted to be a spy. He wanted to serve the state. He wanted to be important. But for a small, scrappy kid from a communal apartment, with mediocre grades and a reputation as a troublemaker, that dream seemed impossibly far away. Part 3: The Family Legacy. To fully understand young Vladimir Putin, we need to know more about the family he came from. Because the Putin family carried secrets and shadows that went far deeper than the siege. Vladimir's paternal grandfather, Spiridon Ivanovich Putin, was born in 1879 in the village of Pominovo in Tver province. He came from a long line of Russian peasants. At the age of 12, he left home to become an apprentice cook in a restaurant in Tver. By 15, he had moved to St. Petersburg to study the culinary arts. Spiridon was ambitious and talented. He worked in some of the city's finest restaurants, mastering French cuisine. He learned not just how to cook, but how to move invisibly through the halls of power, how to be present but unnoticed. At the prestigious Hotel Astoria, young Spiridon served Grigory Rasputin, the infamous mystic and advisor to the Tsar. According to family legend, Rasputin was impressed by the food and the service. He gave Spiridon a gold ruble as a tip, supposedly amused by the similarity of their names. Both ended in Putin or Rasputin. But Spiridon's real career began after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. As the old regime fell and the communists took power, Spiridon found himself cooking for the new elite. By the early 1920s, he was employed at the Gorky Sanatorium near Moscow, cooking for Vladimir Lenin himself. Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, ate meals prepared by Spiridon Putin. The chef had become part of the inner circle of power, not as a politician or an ideologue, but as someone who was needed. Someone who could be trusted with the most intimate domestic details of the leaders' lives. After Lenin's death in 1924, Spiridon continued to cook for Lenin's widow, Nadezhda Krotskaya, and her sister. He remained in this position for years. And then, during the most dangerous period in Soviet history, Spiridon was transferred to a new assignment. He became the personal cook for Joseph Stalin. This was during the Great Purge of the late 1930s, when Stalin was executing hundreds of thousands of people he suspected of disloyalty. Old Bolsheviks, military officers, intellectuals, ordinary citizens, anyone could be arrested in the middle of the night and shot or sent to the Gulag. Stalin trusted almost no one. His paranoia was legendary. People who worked closely with him were in constant danger. One wrong word, One misstep, and you could disappear. Yet Spiridon Putin survived. He cooked at Stalin's dacha in the Moscow region. He prepared Stalin's favorite dishes, particularly Georgian lamb, which only Spiridon could make to Stalin's exact specifications. In a world where perfection was demanded and failure meant death, Spiridon made himself indispensable. He was known for several things. First, his skill. He could cook in a way that pleased even Stalin's difficult palate. Second, his silence. Spiridon never gossiped. He never dropped names. He never talked about what he saw or heard in Stalin's presence. He took his secrets to the grave. And third, his audacity. In a society where saying no to anyone in power could get you killed, Spiridon would actually refuse to cook if the ingredients were not perfect. He would say, essentially, "I cannot make this dish properly without the correct ingredients." In Stalin's Soviet Union, this kind of defiance should have been suicidal. But Spiridon made himself so valuable that even this was tolerated. He was too important to lose. There's also evidence that Spiridon was recruited by the NKVD, the secret police that would later become the KGB. He wasn't just a cook. He was an operative, embedded in the most intimate domestic settings of the Soviet elite, watching, listening, reporting. Spiridon survived Stalin's purges. He survived World War II. After Stalin's death in 1953, he continued to work for the Soviet establishment, cooking at a Communist Party rest house in Ilyanskoye in the Moscow region. He worked as a cook until shortly before his death in 1965, when he was 86 years old. Vladimir Putin was 13 years old when his grandfather died. He had visited Spiridon at that rest house during summer vacations. The old man was quiet, reserved, a man of few words. But he had lived through the entire Soviet experiment, from the revolution through Stalin's terror to the Cold War. Vladimir would later say that his grandfather was a man of absolute integrity. Whether this is true, or whether it's a romanticized memory, is impossible to know. But Spiridon's life taught a lesson, the value of silence, of discretion, of making yourself indispensable to power. Vladimir's father, Vladimir Spiridonovich, had also learned hard lessons about loyalty and service. He had volunteered for the most dangerous missions during the war. He had survived when he should have died. He had been shaped by violence and loss. And Vladimir's mother, Maria Ivanovna, had survived the unsurvivable. She had sent her son to his death in a children's shelter. She had nearly been buried alive. She lived with survivor's guilt and the trauma of the siege for the rest of her life. These were the people who raised young Vladimir, a grandfather who had served Lenin and Stalin and lived to tell no tales. A father who had fought in the NKVD and been crippled by war. A mother who had lost 2 children and barely survived starvation. Is it any wonder that the boy who grew up in this family learned that the world is brutal, that only the strong survive, that loyalty to the state is paramount, and that you must make yourself valuable to power or be crushed by it? Part 4. The Transformation. For the first 11 years of his life, Vladimir Putin seemed destined for mediocrity at best and a life of petty crime at worst. He was a bad student. He was a hooligan. He fought in the streets. He had no obvious talents. But then, something changed. In 1960, Vladimir enrolled at school number 193 at Barskov Lane, near his home. It was an ordinary Soviet school, nothing special. Vladimir was one of about 45 pupils in his class. He was not yet a member of the Young Pioneers, the communist youth organization that most children joined. He was an outsider, small, unremarkable, frequently in trouble. But in the 6th grade, something happened that would alter the trajectory of his life. A teacher took an interest in him. Her name was Vera Dmitrievna Gurevich. She taught German and served as a class mentor. She was known for being strict but fair, demanding but caring. She saw potential in students that others missed. And for some reason, she saw something in Vladimir Putin. She began to push him. She challenged him intellectually. She held him to higher standards. And slowly, Vladimir began to respond. His grades improved. He became more focused, more serious. Gurevich would later say that young Vladimir was a quiet, disciplined boy with sharp intelligence. He was emotionally reserved, but when he committed to something, he gave it everything he had. This relationship was crucial. In a world where Vladimir's parents were too damaged and exhausted to provide much emotional support, Vera Gurevich became a figure of stability, of belief in his potential. Decades later, when Vladimir Putin was president of Russia, he would encounter Vera Gurevich by chance at a Kremlin event. She was in her 90s by then. Putin's reaction was immediate. He broke away from protocol, turned back, and embraced his old teacher warmly. He kissed her and spoke with her for several minutes, reminiscing. Cameras captured the moment, and it went viral. For many Russians, it was a touching scene. The powerful president, momentarily just over, the student, showing genuine affection for the teacher who had believed in him. But perhaps the most transformative event in young Vladimir's life came when he was 11 years old. He discovered martial arts. One day in 1963 or 1964, Vladimir walked into a small, modest gym in the Admiraltysky district of Leningrad. It was the Turbostroitel Sports Club. He wanted to learn Sambo, a Soviet martial art that combined judo and wrestling techniques. The coach was a man named Anatoly Solomonovich Raklin. He was in his mid-20s, a serious, disciplined man who had studied at the Gessen Pedagogical Institute and served in the Black Sea Fleet before becoming a coach. Raklin was building a group of young students. Vladimir Putin was one of the first to join. There was nothing special about the boy at first. He was small, thin, not particularly athletic. Just another kid looking to learn how to fight. But Raklin saw something. Perhaps it was the intensity in Vladimir's eyes. Perhaps it was the desperation of a bullied child looking for a way to defend himself. Perhaps it was simply that Vladimir showed up every day and worked harder than anyone else. Raklin began training Vladimir in Sambo and then in judo. The lessons were not just about fighting techniques. They were about discipline, about controlling your emotions, about strategy over brute force. Raklin's motto was, "If there's character, there'll be a result." When choosing new students, he turned down boys who could do the most pull-ups. Instead, he accepted boys who gave everything they had, even if their hands were trembling and their bodies were shaking. Boys who kept trying until the end. Vladimir Putin was one of those boys. He was not naturally talented. He was not the strongest or the fastest. But he was relentless. He never gave up. He fought until the last second of every match. Raklin became more than a coach to Vladimir. He became a mentor, a father figure, someone who believed in him and pushed him to be better. And Vladimir's parents, initially skeptical of his interest in martial arts, were won over. Raklin took the time to visit their apartment, to sit down with Vladimir Spiridonovich and Maria Ivanovna and explain that judo would not turn their son into a street fighter. Instead, it would teach him discipline, respect, and self-control. It would help him in school and in life. Raklin's visit to that cramped apartment was a turning point. Vladimir's parents gave their blessing, and he threw himself into training with even greater intensity. Vladimir trained with Raklin for more than 10 years. He earned his black belt at the age of 18. He competed in tournaments across Leningrad and later across the Soviet Union. He became a master of sports in both judo and sambo, a prestigious title. Raklin would later describe Vladimir's fighting style. He was known for his extraordinary endurance. He could fight for the entire length of a match without tiring. He was unpredictable, using sudden throws that his opponents didn't see coming. He could throw opponents both to the left and to the right, which was unusual. Most judokas developed a preference for one side. He was, in Raklin's words, a panther on the mat, fighting until the last second. Most importantly, judo gave Vladimir something he had desperately needed: confidence. He was no longer the small, bullied kid from the courtyard. He was a fighter. He was someone to be respected, even feared. His grades improved dramatically. He became more disciplined, more focused. He joined the Young Pioneers, then the Komsomol. He stopped being a troublemaker and became a serious student. In his teenage years, Vladimir transferred to school number 281, a chemistry-focused magnet school that only accepted students with near-perfect grades. It was a competitive, prestigious institution. Vladimir, the former hooligan, had earned his place there. At school 281, Vladimir studied chemistry intensively. He also played handball. He worked at the school radio station, where he played music by Western rock bands like the Beatles, which was somewhat daring in the Soviet Union. But his real passion remained martial arts and his growing dream of joining the KGB. The combination of Vera Gurevich's mentorship and Anatoly Raklin's training had transformed Vladimir Putin. He went from a street kid with no prospects to a disciplined, ambitious young man with a clear goal. But the transformation came at a cost. The lessons Vladimir learned in those years were harsh ones. Strength matters. Weakness is punished. Trust few people. Make yourself indispensable. Fight until the last second. Never give up, even when cornered. These lessons, learned in the dvor and the dojo, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Part 5. The Dream Takes Shape. By the time Vladimir Putin was 16 years old, he had a clear goal. He wanted to join the KGB, the Committee for State Security, the most powerful and feared organization in the Soviet Union. Where did this ambition come from? Partly from the spy films and books that were popular in the 1960s. Partly from the stories his grandfather might have told, or not told, about serving the Soviet elite. Partly from a desire to escape the poverty and limitations of his working-class background. But there was something deeper too. The KGB represented power, order, control. In a chaotic world, the KGB was the organization that kept everything in line. For a boy who had grown up in chaos, in a city still scarred by war, in an apartment where 3 families fought over one bathroom, the idea of being part of an organization that controlled everything must have been deeply appealing. So in 1968, at the age of 16, Vladimir Putin did something audacious. He walked into the KGB headquarters in Leningrad and asked to speak to someone about joining. He was shown into an office. A KGB officer looked at this scrawny teenager and listened to his requests. The officer's response was blunt. The KGB does not accept walk-in applicants. You cannot simply show up and ask to join. If the KGB is interested in you, they will come to you. But, the officer continued, if you want to be considered, there are things you can do. Study law at university. Serve in the military if called upon. Excel in your studies and in your conduct. Prove yourself worthy of attention. And then, perhaps, the KGB might approach you. Vladimir listened carefully. He asked questions. How long would it take? What exactly should he study? The officer answered patiently, perhaps amused by this persistent teenager, perhaps seeing something in him. Vladimir left the building with a plan. He would do exactly what the officer had said. He would graduate from high school with excellent grades. He would apply to Leningrad State University to study law. He would excel. He would make himself noticed. And he would wait for the KGB to come to him. For the next 4 years, Vladimir focused intensively on his studies. He graduated from school 281 in 1970 with high grades. He had become a model Soviet student. Disciplined, hard-working, politically reliable. He applied to the law department at Leningrad State University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the Soviet Union. Admission was highly competitive, but Vladimir was accepted. At university, Vladimir kept a low profile. He was not a political activist. He did not participate in protests or underground movements. He studied diligently. He continued his judo training. He was patient. He was doing exactly what the KGB officer had told him to do. He was proving himself worthy of notice. During his time at university, Vladimir met Anatoly Sobchak, an assistant professor who taught business law. Sobchak was brilliant, charismatic, a rising star in Soviet legal scholarship. He would later become one of the leaders of Russia's democratic movement and the first elected mayor of St. Petersburg. The relationship between Putin and Sobchak would become crucial later in Putin's life. But at this point, Sobchak was simply an impressive professor and Putin was simply a quiet, diligent student. In his 4th year at university, in 1974, something happened that Vladimir had been waiting for. He was approached by KGB recruiters. They had been watching him. They had checked his background. His grandfather's service to Lenin and Stalin counted in his favor. His father's war record counted in his favor. His own discipline, his loyalty, his discretion, all had been noted. They offered him the opportunity to join the Committee for State Security, the KGB. For Vladimir Putin, it was the happiest moment of his young life. The dream he had held since he was 16, since he had walked into that KGB building and been turned away, was finally coming true. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had been in service of this moment. He accepted immediately. Part 6. The Making of a KGB Officer. In 1975, Vladimir Putin graduated from Leningrad State University with a law degree. His thesis was titled, "The Most Favored Nation Trading Principle in International Law." It was a solid, unremarkable piece of legal scholarship. But Vladimir's real education was about to begin. He was officially inducted into the KGB and sent for training at the 401st KGB School in Okhta, a district of Leningrad. This was where Soviet intelligence officers learned their craft. The training was intensive. Vladimir learned surveillance techniques, how to follow someone without being noticed, how to recognize when you're being followed. He learned recruitment methods, how to identify potential assets, how to approach them, how to manipulate them into providing information. He learned interrogation techniques, document analysis, dent drops, codes, cover stories, how to lie convincingly, how to blend in, how to be invisible. He was taught the fundamental principles of intelligence work: patience, discipline, paranoia, trust no one, verify everything, always have an escape route, never let your emotions show. These were lessons that Vladimir already understood instinctively from his childhood. The KGB training simply formalized and refined what he had already learned in the streets and courtyards of Leningrad. After completing his training, Vladimir was assigned to the second chief directorate of the KGB. This directorate was responsible for internal counterintelligence. Its job was to monitor foreigners in the Soviet Union and to watch Soviet citizens for signs of disloyalty. Vladimir's work in Leningrad involved surveillance of foreign diplomats, journalists, business people, and tourists. He also monitored Leningrad citizens who had contact with foreigners or who were suspected of dissent. Much of the work was tedious. Hours of sitting in cars, watching apartment buildings, taking photographs, filing reports, following people through the streets, recruiting informants, checking credentials. It was not glamorous. It was bureaucratic, methodical, repetitive. But Vladimir was good at it. He was patient. He was thorough. He didn't make mistakes. He followed orders without question. He was exactly the kind of officer the KGB valued. Reliable, invisible, loyal. In 1983, Vladimir's personal life took a significant turn. He married Ludmila Alexandrovna Skrebneva, a flight attendant from Kaliningrad whom he had met at a theater performance. Ludmila was 25 years old, attractive, intelligent, and reserved. She came from a working-class background similar to Vladimir's. Her father was a mechanic. Her mother worked in a factory. Their courtship was brief. Vladimir was not romantic or demonstrative. He was practical, even cold. But Ludmila saw something in him: stability, seriousness, ambition. They were married in a simple ceremony. No church wedding, as religion was officially discouraged in the Soviet Union. Just a civil registration. Vladimir wore a dark suit. Ludmila wore a brown dress. The marriage produced 2 daughters. Maria was born in Leningrad in 1985. Katerina was born in Dresden, East Germany, in 1986. Vladimir and Ludmila kept their children completely out of the public eye. Even decades later, when Vladimir became president, the details of his daughters' lives remained closely guarded secrets. This obsession with privacy, with protecting his family from scrutiny, was another lesson from childhood. In the communal apartment, there was no privacy. Everything was exposed. Vladimir hated that. As an adult, he would guard his personal life with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. Part 7. The Lessons of Childhood. Vladimir Putin's childhood, from his birth in 1952 to his induction into the KGB in 1975, was a crucible. It forged a particular kind of person. A person shaped by trauma, by loss, by the brutal struggle for survival in a harsh environment. What lessons did young Vladimir learn? What worldview did his childhood create? First, the lesson of survival. Vladimir's parents survived the unsurvivable. They lived through the siege when more than 1 million others died. This created a family narrative: we are survivors. We endure. We do whatever it takes to stay alive. But survival came at a terrible cost. The trauma, the loss of 2 children, the permanent psychological damage. Vladimir grew up in the shadow of this trauma. He learned that the world is brutal and unforgiving. You survive or you die. There is no middle ground. Second, the lesson of strength. In the courtyard, in the streets, strength mattered. If you were weak, you were bullied, beaten, humiliated. Vladimir was weak, and he suffered for it. But then he discovered judo. He learned that you could compensate for lack of size with skill, with strategy, with relentless determination. This shaped his worldview. Strength is paramount. Weakness invites attack. You must make yourself strong, or others will destroy you. Third, the lesson of loyalty. Vladimir's grandfather served Lenin and Stalin. His father volunteered for the most dangerous missions. Loyalty to the state, to power, was the highest virtue in the Putin family. But this loyalty was not blind. It was strategic. Spiridon Putin made himself indispensable to Stalin. Vladimir Spiridonovich survived the war by being useful. Vladimir learned that loyalty must be rewarded and that you must make yourself valuable to those in power. Fourth, the lesson of silence. Spiridon Putin survived Stalin's purges by never talking. He kept secrets. He was discreet. Vladimir's parents also kept their emotions hidden, their trauma buried. They did not talk about their pain. Vladimir learned to be silent, to reveal nothing, to keep his thoughts and feelings locked away. This would become one of his defining characteristics as an adult. He is unreadable. He gives nothing away. Fifth, the lesson of order. Vladimir grew up in chaos. The communal apartment was chaotic. The courtyard was chaotic. The 1990s, which we'll come to later, would be even more chaotic. Throughout his childhood, Vladimir craved order, structure, discipline. The KGB represented ultimate order. A hierarchical organization where everyone knew their place, where rules were followed, where chaos was controlled. For someone who had grown up in disorder, this was deeply appealing. Sixth, the lesson of humiliation. Russia, the mighty Soviet Union, had been humiliated in the 1990s. It lost its empire. Its economy collapsed. It became weak. For someone like Vladimir, raised on stories of Soviet victory in World War II, raised to believe in the power and glory of the motherland, this was unbearable. He learned that humiliation is the worst thing that can happen to a nation or a person. Anything is justified to avoid or reverse humiliation. Strength, pride, respect, these are more important than freedom or prosperity. And finally, the lesson of the indispensable man. From his grandfather, from his own experience, Vladimir learned that if you make yourself indispensable to power, you can survive anything. You can rise from nothing. You can achieve anything. This was the boy who would become a man. This was the foundation upon which everything else would be built. Closing reflection. On October 7, 1952, a child was born in a broken city, in a family haunted by death and trauma, in an apartment overrun with rats. He was small, weak, unremarkable. He should have disappeared into obscurity, just another forgotten Soviet citizen, just another victim of history. But Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin did not disappear. Through a combination of ambition, discipline, ruthlessness, and calculated loyalty, he would rise from that communal apartment to the highest levels of power. His childhood shaped him in profound ways. The trauma of his parents, the poverty and humiliation of communal living, the violence of the streets, the discipline of judo, the dream of serving the state. These experiences created a worldview, a belief that the world is brutal and only the strong survive, a conviction that order must be imposed on chaos, a certainty that loyalty to the state is the highest virtue, a determination never to be weak, never to be humiliated, never to be backed into a corner like that rat in the stairwell. Understanding Vladimir Putin's childhood does not excuse the actions he would later take as president, but it does help explain them. It provides context for the man he became. The boy from Barskov Lane carried the ghosts of the siege, the lessons of the courtyard, the discipline of the dojo, and the ambitions of a generation that believed in service to the state above all else. That boy would grow up to rule Russia, and the world would have to reckon with what he had learned in those formative years. This has been the story of Vladimir Putin's childhood, the story of how a nobody from nowhere became somebody, the story of survival, ambition, and the shadows that shaped a future leader.